Hi everybody, it's Kerrie here at the North East Autism Society. I am joined today again by Dr. Helen Leonard, who is a consultant in paediatric neurodisability at the Great North Children's Hospital. Hi Helen.
Hi Kerrie.
Helen's joined us today because we're going to be having a little chat about toileting, because I get a lot of questions and queries from my families about their children. All kinds of questions about when the right time to toilet train is, maybe some things that they do that appear unusual to the parents. So we're just going to have a chat today and see if we can answer some of your questions, really. So Helen, in your role, I suppose is toileting something that you talk about a lot with parents?
Loads and loads and loads. I feel like I talk about weeing and pooing far more than is natural. But yeah, it's really important to people, understandably so. And when it goes well, it's great, and it's just one of those phases. But when people are struggling with it, I think it sometimes feels like it's taken over people's lives. It's huge. So yeah, it's important that we try and support people to get it right.
Absolutely. So I suppose the first question, one of the ones I get most often actually, is how do we know if my autistic child is ready to toilet train?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's tricky sometimes, but I can give you some broad guidance and rules. I would say maybe starting the other way around when they're not ready. So just because a child has hit 2.5 or 3, or this is the age their brother or sister has toilet trained, doesn't necessarily mean they're ready. If a child is quite happy to sit in a soaking wet or pooey nappy and they're not in the slightest bit bothered, they're not showing any indication that they're bothered, they're not trying to sort of wriggle or come to their parents or do anything, they are probably not ready. It doesn't matter what age they are, but they're probably not ready if they're showing no awareness at all. You can still put some simple sort of first steps in place to get into good habits, but I think you should set your expectations fairly low if they're really showing no awareness that they're wet or dirty.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So another question I get asked a lot is if you have a child that doesn't use verbal language to communicate, how and can you actually toilet train a child with no language?
Yeah, absolutely. You can. You don't need language to toilet train. As you well know, Kerrie, children with autism tend to be visual learners. So they learn by watching and copying things they see rather than being given verbal instructions and being told. So the strategies that we recommend for toilet training children with autism are typically very visual, and that goes back to what I was saying before, that you can put those simple steps in place really early on, even if they might not be ready. Your expectations are, you can still put some basic things in place to help with readiness. Mm-hmm. So things like, if you're changing their nappy and they've done a wee or a poo, if you change them near the toilet or next to the toilet or in the bathroom, if that's physically possible in your house, or at the nursery, get that association between weeing, pooing, being dirty and the toilet. And the other thing that's really helpful is if they've done a poo in the nappy, showing you tip the poo down the toilet. So that's visual association is where the poo goes. Now you don't need language to get that and make that link. And the other thing for families, again, a visual strategy, is getting them to watch other people in the family. It's really helpful if you've got an older brother or sister, watching them go to the toilet. And if you haven't, taking them with parents. A lot of the children I see with autism are taken to the loo anyway, because they get up to all sorts of mischief once mum or dad closes themselves in the loo. But actually it's really good for their learning, getting them to watch mum and dad go to the toilet. Might not be very nice, it might seem a bit of an odd thing to do, but it will help them to learn. And even if they're not ready, seeing if they'll just have a turn to just get them used to the idea of sitting on the toilet and having a go after somebody else has. So they're good strategies to get the association between wee and poo and the toilet. And then I think the other one we sometimes use if children are a bit more able and have some understanding of verbal language, there's a free PDF booklet people can download called Pooh Goes to Poohland. And again, that's about teaching them that's where poo goes.
Yeah, because I suppose for autistic children and for some children that aren't autistic, actually understanding what happens when they have a poo and where that goes, that can be really unpredictable, can't it? And that can actually bring on a lot of anxiety, like where is it going? You know, it can be quite frightening, that part of the, you know, it was in my body 1 minute ago and now where has it gone? That is terrifying for some, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think for a lot of the children I see, there's a big sensory component to it as well. That sensation of having a poo on the toilet is very different from having a poo in a nappy, and that transition is often difficult for children with autism for a lot of reasons. Transition and change, as you know, is often really difficult, but the sensory aspect often has quite a big impact. And I often say to parents, all right, if I was to put a nappy onto you now and just say, well, have a poo in that, it's just the same as pooing on the toilet, you would find it really unpleasant and uncomfortable, because it's a totally different sensation. And it's the same for children with autism, but the other way around, transitioning from a nappy to the toilet is often really tricky. And often I'll see children who have the awareness and all those sort of connections between their bowels and their brains, so that they're ready to and they know what to do, but actually from a sensory point of view it's quite unpleasant and distressing. And for them, we've got to do that as a much more gentle stage process. So sometimes, for example, we'd get them to sit on the toilet and poo in a nappy, because they'll withhold and withhold and withhold, often for days, a week or more, unless they have a nappy on. The advice you use for typically developing children is often to just take the nappy off, let them, you know, and eventually they'll go if their preference is. But for autistic children, it's much more persistent, it's much more distressing. There's a big component of sensory processing, of anxiety in there, and it's often not a good strategy to do that. And it's a much more gentle state process, and we sometimes might have to get occupational therapy and psychology involved to help with that transition.
Absolutely, yeah. I think them sensory differences are really important, aren't they? And even things like, you know, I've had children where it'll be the smell of the bathroom that's problematic, or the temperature change when you actually sit on a toilet, all them type of things parents, you know, need to be considering. And I think we've actually put together for parents a helpful kind of bathroom checklist as well for when they are using the bathroom with their children. Just things to think about, you know, from anything to light to temperature to you know, touch, all that kind of things that we sometimes we miss them, but for our autistic children, they've got sensory differences, they're causing them big problems. Absolutely.
And that leads to something else which I'm sure you see as well, that often children with autism will learn a skill in one context, but then will not generalise it to somewhere else. So they might learn to toilet train at nursery or home, but then will only do it in that one place. And that might just be because they haven't generalised the skill, like people with autism don't do with a lot of skills, or it may be specific sensory issues or preference issues around different toilets. Fear of hand dryers is another one I've seen, absolutely refusing to go anywhere into a toilet that's got an airflow hand dryer, which can be quite distressing from a sensory point of view. So it's thinking about all of those things as well.
Absolutely. So I suppose in your role, Helen, with your experience, what would be your top tips for for successful toileting? What would they be?
Start off from very early on with those visual strategies that we discussed before. So changing them in the bathroom, watching other people, tipping poo down the toilet, but just doing it very briefly, making it fun, low expectations, and just incorporating it as part of your daily routine. If people are struggling, don't try and force the issue, because everybody's just going to get stressed and distressed. It's not going to work. Big one is make sure the child is not constipated. In terms of barriers and problems, I see that's a big one. Many of the children I see have very selective, quite quirky, odd diets because of the sensory issues. The diets often contain little veg and often not much fruit either. So by nature, they've got a tendency to be constipated. And if a child is constipated, passing hard, lumpy, uncomfortable poo, they're going to tend to hang on. And the more they hang on, the harder and lumpier, more uncomfortable it's going to be. And you get into a vicious circle. And they then begin to associate having a poo as being something unpleasant. And it's going to be incredibly difficult to toilet train somebody when it's an unpleasant association for them. So children should be passing soft poo every single day, at least once a day, and it should be smooth on the surface, not cracked, and no firmer than toothpaste. If it's bulky, hard, cracked, uncomfortable, lumpy, less than once a day, any of those things, they're constipated and they need their diet changed. And if that's not possible, they need some laxatives. And you're going to find toilet training really, really tricky if they're constipated.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really important for families to know. I think that's a really, you know, probably a barrier that a lot of our families might not actually, know about, because it's maybe something, I know me and you talk about poo and wee a lot, Helen, but I don't think people out there talk about it enough to the general public.
Often I'll say, what's their poo like? And people just go, well, it's normal. And I'd say, well, what does it look like? And you can use the Bristol stool chart scale, or you can ask them to, say bananas, sausages, rabbit drop, that kind of thing. But establishing what some people think is normal actually isn't for a young child. It should be as I've described.
Brilliant. No, that's really helpful. So are there any other barriers that you see with toilet training in your experience?
We've talked about all this, well, we've touched on all the sensory things, but that is a big one. I think people trying to toilet train children who simply aren't ready. So it can be about those connections just aren't there and they're not recognising. I think another thing that people who aren't used to children or teenagers or young adults, even with autism, that sometimes struggle to understand is about the social understanding and social motivation part of toilet training. So I see a lot of older children with autism and even young adults who all the connections are there. So if you take them to the toilet, they will wee and poo on the toilet, and for periods will manage in normal underwear. However, if they're left to their own devices rather than toileted regularly, they don't have that social motivation and social understanding that they need to take themselves there, and will sometimes continue what they're doing and just tend to wee or poo without getting that social understanding that this is what I need to do at this time. And that's a slightly different thing, and it's quite autism specific. And I find what works well with that group of children is just putting a regular toileting plan in place. So leaving them to recognise and take themselves there probably isn't going to work. Taking them to the toilet, getting them to set an alarm on a wristwatch, or the adults who are looking after them to set an alarm every 2 to 3 hours and actually take into well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, brilliant, great. Is there anything you feel we haven't covered there, Helen, that we need to touch on before we end the video?
No, I think we've covered most of the main things. I'm sure there'll be questions that people have that we can come back to, but great. I think that's the main areas.
Brilliant. So if people do watch this video and you've got any questions, then just let us know and we'll come back and answer those for you. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Bye.